for critics like myself of Plan Mexico is that it militarizes society. What we have is, with the focus on enforcement, there's a much broader participation of the Army in drug activities, which means for the first time, not for the first time, but for the first time on a much more expansive level, the Army is actually working against its own people, in a sense, even though some of them are drug traffickers. And they're working within their own territory, whereas their constitutional formation has to do with defending the country against external threats, as well as responding to national disasters, which, as you probably know, here in Mexico we've had many in just the recent months. So this creates a situation where, and we're already seeing this, there are major violations of human rights. The Army was not trained or formed to do this kind of work. There's lack of accountability within the Army structure. We're working among the citizenry. And to have towns that are filled with armed soldiers creates a breeding ground for conflicts and for violations of human rights. And the concern is that when this model is applied on an even broader scale through this aid package from the United States, the human rights violations and the conflicts that we've seen on a local level will continue. The other part of it is that the drug cartels in Mexico, there have been changes, but in some ways it's nothing new. There have always been drug cartels in Mexico, and what there has been is kind of an uneasy balance between their different territories, between themselves, and in their relationship with the government, in which some activity was obviously permitted and some activity was controlled. That's still the case. There's obviously still collusion with government officials on all levels of government, but the crackdowns have created turf wars between some of the cartels, which is an explanation for why this year in particular we're seeing a big increase in the violence. The other explanation has to do with the change in drug trafficking here in Mexico. It used to be, as you mentioned, a transit route for cocaine from Colombia. There are strong relationships between the Mexican cartels and the Colombian cartels, and it continues to be that as well. And what's happening now is that consumption in Mexico is also growing. So some of the turf wars have to do with markets and keeping certain cartels in or out of local areas. Then the other thing is, of course, the methamphetamines trade, which used to not exist, and then was minor and has grown very, very quickly lately, partly as a result of a crackdown in the United States on local production. So it moved to Mexico.
Okay. Mrs. Carlson, could we also move on a little bit more to NAFTA and how life has changed in Mexico since it signed the agreement with NAFTA, with the two northern states, United States and Canada? And how do you see the Mexican life changing for the people since they moved their geopolitical interests to the north, and as it seems they're cutting them from the rest of Latin America?
Yes, I think that's a true characterization. Mexico has always been very oriented toward the United States. It's been a conflictive relationship, but it's also been, at many points in its history, a dependent relationship. But NAFTA represented a major change in the sense that it did two things. It created a far greater dependency of the Mexican economy on the United States. Over 90% of exports and imports are with the United States, with one country, which is never a good idea. And it also locked into place what we call the neoliberal economic model. It locked into place this model that assigns distribution of wealth, access to natural resources, productive processes, all to the private market, with almost no state intervention except to help the private companies make a profit. So when that happened, the Mexican government, which of course is still a developing country, although it has a powerful economy, it has a huge part of its population living on less than $2 a day. About half, of course there are different methodologies, but about half of Mexicans live in poverty. And this country joined into an economic relationship with the world's foremost economic and military superpower, with nothing whatsoever done to correct the imbalance in that relationship. If you start out a relationship that way, that's unequal, and you have no means of compensation or any kinds of mechanisms for the weaker country to catch up, what happens is what we see now in Mexico, an increase in the inequality. If you look at the relationship between the Mexican and U.S. economies, wages are more unequal than they were before. Production, growth, there's this incredible inequality. And when you look at Mexico itself, it's happened internally as well. We have extremely wealthy people now who are involved in transnational corporations. The wealthiest man on the planet is a Mexican. His name is Carlos Slim. He began his fortune when, according to the International Financial Institution's recipes, Mexico privatized its state-owned enterprises, and he was practically given the monopoly over telecommunications. With that as a base, he began to create a financial empire, given all the help that the government and the globalized system could possibly give, and is now the wealthiest man in the country. Meanwhile, we have 500,000 Mexicans a year going to the United States because they can't make a living for their families. They're going illegally, they're risking death on the border, but they cannot feed their families, especially in the countryside, but also in the cities, because unemployment is so high, because there has not been the generation of jobs that are needed to create a decent living for all Mexicans.
Mrs. Carlson, one more question before we end. There have been some fears coming out from both Canada and the United States that there is a plan to implement a North American Union that would resemble the European Union in almost all forms. Do you believe that Plan Mexico is just one policy that would bring about this North American Union and help it along the practical means?
No, I think they're two different things. The North American Union first came up as an academic proposal that would be the next step in North American integration. However, in the United States, the powerful right wing is very much against such a union, and in fact, there's almost no political support for that kind of a union. You're talking about three countries that are very, very different. Their histories are different, their politics are different, their economies and their cultures are different. And they, in general, each one of them wants to preserve that difference. So I think the criticism and the fears of the North American Union are really not well-founded. It's not something that could even possibly happen because the United States doesn't want it, and neither do the other two countries. However, what the United States does want is a different kind of union. They want a union in which Mexico and Canada become subordinated to U.S. interests. And in large part, they've already accomplished this. Because of the dependency of Mexico economically on the United States, they also have a certain, not dependency, but certainly the United States exercises a huge amount of influence on almost all other aspects of Mexican society, including its foreign policy. Mexico did not vote in favor of the invasion of Iraq, but there was a lot of pressure on it too, and even the business classes were saying that they should. In the end, they didn't. However, in other forums, you can see where that pressure is exercised, and